Sometimes the most valuable treasures come with the smallest price tags. In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, where cattle outnumbered people and mercy was scarcer than water, a paralyzed woman sat silent on the auction block while men jeered and spat tobacco juice at her feet. The auctioneer's hammer fell at $1, the price of a shot of whiskey. But when a weathered cowboy named Jake stepped forward with silver coins jangling in his calloused hands, nobody expected what would happen next. Was this broken woman about to become just another possession in a cruel world, or would she transform the loneliest heart on the frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Jake McKenna strode toward the auction platform, his spurs singing a metallic tune against the worn wooden planks. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Bartlett, grinned through yellowed teeth as he counted. The coins, $5 silver, far more than the $1 bid. Well, McKenna. Didn't figure you for the type to buy damaged goods, Bartlett sneered, pocketing his commission. Jake's jaw tightened, but his hands remained gentle as he approached the woman. Elizabeth, he'd heard someone call her that, sat motionless in a crude wooden chair, her legs covered by a threadbare blanket. Her dark hair, though dusty, was pinned with dignity, and her green eyes held a fierce pride that hadn't been broken despite her circumstances. "Ma'am," Jake said softly, removing his hat, "we'll be heading to my place now. It ain't much, but it's clean and quiet." Elizabeth's eyes searched his face, looking for the cruelty she'd come to expect from men. Instead, she found weathered lines that spoke of hard work and loss, blue eyes that held no malice, only a strange sort of understanding. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Jake turned to the crowd. "I'll need help getting her to my wagon. Carry your own property." "McKenna!" someone shouted, followed by harsh laughter. Jake's hand moved to his holster, a gesture born of instinct rather than real threat. "She's a human being, and she'll be treated as such. Anyone who says different can discuss it with me and my cult." The laughter died. Two younger men, perhaps shamed by Jake's words, stepped forward to help. Together they carried Elizabeth's chair to Jake's wagon, where he'd already spread fresh hay and blankets in the bed. "I'm going to lift you now," Jake explained, his voice steady and calm. "I'll be as careful as I can." For the first time, Elizabeth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The quilt. In my bag." Jake found her worn carpet bag and pulled out a quilt, faded but clean. His breath caught. The pattern was similar to one his mother had made years ago before the fever took her. He spread it in the wagon bed, then returned to Elizabeth. His arms were strong from years of ranch work, but he lifted her as if she were made of spun glass. She weighed so little, like a bird with broken wings. As he settled her in the wagon, she clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, her only possessions in the world. The ride out of town was silent, except for the creak of wagon wheels and the soft snorting of Jake's horses. Elizabeth watched. The town recede, each bump in the road sending sharp pains through her body, though she'd grown expert at hiding such discomfort. The late afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, and despite everything, she found beauty in it. Jake's ranch appeared as the sun touched the horizon, a modest cabin with a good roof, a well-maintained barn, and a small garden plot. It spoke of a man who took care with things, who believed in order and hard work. "Been just me here for 3 years, Jake said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving town. Since Mary and little Thomas passed. Elizabeth understood then. This wasn't about owning someone. It was about filling an empty space, about having another soul under his roof. She'd seen enough loneliness to recognize it in another. Jake pulled the wagon close to the porch, studying the steps with a frown. "I'll need to build a ramp," he muttered, more to himself than to her. For now, he lifted her again, chair and all, carrying her into the cabin's main room. The interior was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a simple table, and chairs occupied the center, and a curtained doorway led to what must be a bedroom. Everything was neat, orderly, but it had the hollow feeling of a place where laughter had been absent too long. Jake set her chair near the fireplace and immediately set about building a fire, though the evening was warm. "Thought you might like the light," he explained awkwardly. "I'll heat some water too. Figure you might want to wash up after being in town." Elizabeth watched him work, noting the careful way he moved, the gentle handling of everyday objects. When he'd filled a basin with warm water and set it on a stool beside her with soap and clean cloths, he stepped back. "I'll be seeing to the horses. Take your time. There's a bell on the table there if you need anything." He fled then. This strong man who'd faced down a hostile crowd fled from the intimacy of a woman's bathing. Elizabeth almost smiled. Her first near smile in months. As the door closed behind him, she dipped the cloth in the warm water and began to wash away the dust and shame of the auction block. Through the window she could see Jake in the barn, talking softly to his horses as he removed their harness. She'd been sold like livestock, reduced to $1's worth of burden. But somehow, in this quiet place with this quiet man, she felt the first stirring of something she'd thought lost forever. Dignity, perhaps even hope. The silver dollar that had started the bidding lay forgotten in Bartlett's pocket, but its true value had already begun to reveal itself in small acts of kindness and the promise of a new beginning. The morning sun slanted through clean windows, casting geometric patterns across the cabin floor. Elizabeth woke in the bed Jake had insisted she take, while he'd made a pallet near the fireplace. She'd protested with gestures and expressions, but he'd been firm. "A lady needs a proper bed," he'd said, and that was that. For 3 days they'd existed in near silence, developing a rhythm of glances and nods. Jake would help her to the chair each morning, prepare simple meals, and disappear. For hours to tend his ranch. Evenings found him reading by lamplight while she sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap, watching the fire dance. On the 4th morning, Jake entered carrying something flat and rectangular. "Made this," he said, his voice gruff with embarrassment. He held up a small slate board, the kind children used in school, with a piece of chalk tied to it by string. "Figured you might have things to say." Elizabeth's eyes widened. She reached for the slate with trembling hands, her fingers closing around the chalk. For a long moment, she simply held it, as if it were precious beyond measure. Then, with careful strokes, she wrote, "Thank you." Jake's face transformed. The lines around his eyes crinkled, and his mouth curved into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "You're welcome, ma'am. What else would you like to say?" She erased the words, and wrote again, "My name is Elizabeth Harper. Pleased to make your proper acquaintance, Miss Harper." "Mrs. Harper," she corrected, then added quickly, "Widow." Jake nodded, understanding passing between them. They were both marked by loss, both adrift in a world that had little use for broken things. "How long?" she wrote. 3 years come winter. The fever took them both in a week. She was my whole world. And Thomas, he'd just turned 4. Jake's voice caught, but he pressed on. "What about you?" Elizabeth's chalk moved slowly. "Husband died in the war. I was traveling west to live with cousins when the stagecoach overturned. The driver was drunk. My back... The doctor said I'd never walk again." "Doctors can be wrong," Jake said firmly. She wrote, "The cousins didn't want a crippled burden. They arranged the mail order contract, told the agency I was damaged goods. Better to get something for me than nothing." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "No one should be sold like that. No one. Yet here I am," she wrote, a bitter twist to her mouth. "Here you are," Jake agreed. "But not as property. I don't care what that paper says. You're a guest in my home. Mrs. Harper, free to leave whenever you choose." "How? I cannot walk, have no money, no family." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then stay until you figure out what comes next. No obligations, no expectations, just stay." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for the trap, the hidden cruelty. Finding none, she wrote, "Why did you buy me?" It was Jake's turn to be silent. He moved to the window, looking out at the vast landscape. "Loneliness is a peculiar thing," he finally said. "It can make a man do foolish things, desperate things. When I saw you there, maintaining your dignity while those animals mocked you, I saw strength, the kind of strength Mary had, and I thought maybe we could help each other, not as man and property, but as two people who understand what it means to lose everything." Elizabeth's chalk moved across the slate. "I was a teacher. Before a teacher?" Jake turned back to her, interest sparking in his eyes. "What did you teach?" "Everything. It was a small school in Missouri. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history." She paused, then added, "I loved it. We have no school here in Cedar Ridge. The children grow up wild and unlettered." "A shame," she wrote, and Jake could see the teacher in her mourning the waste of young minds. That evening Jake brought out his small collection of books. Would you like me to read aloud? My Mary used to enjoy it when I'd read." To her, Elizabeth nodded eagerly and pointed to a worn copy of David Copperfield. Jake's reading was slow but careful, his deep voice giving life to Dickens' words. When Elizabeth held up her slate with, "You read well," he flushed like a schoolboy. "Mary taught me," he admitted. "I couldn't read much when we married. She said a man ought to know his letters." As the fire burned low, Elizabeth wrote one more. "Message, tomorrow. Will you teach me about the ranch?" Jake smiled. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Harper." That night, for the first time since the accident, Elizabeth fell asleep without crying. In his makeshift bed by the fire, Jake allowed himself to feel something he'd thought dead forever. A tiny spark of contentment, the promise that perhaps the empty echoes of his life might once again know the warmth of companionship. The slate, board rested on the table between them, a bridge built of chalk and goodwill, waiting to carry whatever words tomorrow might bring. Jake McKenna was not a man given to begging, but here he stood in Doc Morrison's office, hat in hand, pride swallowed like bitter medicine. "She needs proper medical attention, Doc. I'll pay whatever it costs." Morrison, a thin man with silver spectacles and the perpetual smell of carbolic acid about him, looked up from his medical journal. "The paralyzed woman from the auction? Jake, what's the point? Some things can't be fixed. You don't know that without examining her." "I know enough. Spinal injuries are beyond medical science. Besides, the whole town's talking about your foolish purchase. $1 for a broken woman? You'd have done better buying a lame horse. At least you could put it out of its misery." Jake's hand moved to his gun belt, an unconscious gesture that made Morrison pale. "You'll watch your tongue when speaking about Mrs. Harper, or we'll have more than words between us." The doctor raised his hands placatingly. "No offense meant. I'm just being practical." Being practical got her sold like cattle. "I'm asking you to be a doctor, not a judge." Jake pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. "This should cover your fee and then some." Morrison eyed the money, sighed, and reached for his medical bag. "Fine, but don't expect miracles." The ride to Jake's ranch was tense with silence. When they arrived, Jake went in first to prepare Elizabeth. He found her in her chair by the window, using her slate to work out arithmetic problems. "Keeping her mind sharp," she'd explained. "The doctor's here," he said gently. "He's going to examine you, see what might be done." Elizabeth's chalk trembled slightly as she wrote, "I've seen many doctors. They all say the same thing. Maybe this time will be different. Will you try? For me?" The last two words slipped out unbidden, hanging in the air between them. Elizabeth studied his face, then nodded slowly. Morrison entered with professional briskness, but Jake noticed how his demeanor shifted upon seeing Elizabeth. Perhaps it was her quiet dignity, or the intelligence in her green eyes, but the doctor's casual dismissiveness faded. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Dr. Morrison. I'll need to examine your spine and test your reflexes. Mr. McKenna, perhaps you should—" "I'll stay," Jake said firmly. "For propriety's sake." The examination was thorough and at times painful. Elizabeth bit her lip but made no sound as Morrison tested sensation along her legs, checked reflexes, and gently manipulated her spine. Jake stood by, his knuckles white. As he gripped the back of a chair, Finally, Morrison sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Harper, can you feel this?" He pricked her foot with a pin. Elizabeth's eyes widened. She nodded vigorously. "And this?" He moved the pin to her calf. Another nod. Morrison opened his medical journal, running his finger along a passage. "The injury is lower than I expected. The paralysis seems to be partially due to severe inflammation, pressing on the nerves, not complete severance. With proper treatment, specific exercises, massage, perhaps some of the newer therapies I've been reading about, there's a possibility." "A possibility of what?" Jake demanded. "She might walk again, not normally perhaps, and it would take months of hard work, but yes, there's hope." Elizabeth's slate clattered to the floor as her hands flew to her face. Tears streamed between her fingers. The first tears Jake had seen from her. Morrison pulled out a notebook and began writing. "These are the exercises. They must be done daily without fail. The massage techniques are, well, they'll require assistance." He glanced meaningfully at Jake. "I'll do whatever's needed," Jake said without hesitation. "It will be painful," Morrison warned. "The nerves awakening, the muscles remembering. It's not pleasant." Elizabeth retrieved her slate and wrote firmly, "I'm not afraid of pain." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit you'll need." He turned to Jake. "You'll need supplies, liniment, specific oils, perhaps some equipment to help with the exercises. It won't be cheap. Money's no object where her health is concerned." As Morrison prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Jake, I owe you an apology. And you, Mrs. Harper. I let the town's gossip cloud my judgment. What you're doing here, it's admirable." After he left, Jake found Elizabeth crying again. But these were different tears. He knelt beside her chair, uncertain. "Hope," she wrote on her slate. "I'd forgotten what it felt like." "We'll start the exercises tomorrow," Jake promised. "Every day, as many times as needed. You'll walk again, Elizabeth. I swear it." She reached out and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated contact. Her fingers were soft against his calloused palm, and in that simple touch, a promise was made. They would face this challenge together. That evening, Jake built a set of parallel bars in the main room, following the rough sketch Morrison had provided. As he worked, Elizabeth watched, occasionally holding up her slate with suggestions. They were no longer stranger and charge, buyer and bought. They were two people united by a common goal, and in that unity, the first real foundations of something deeper were laid. The medical journal Morrison had left behind lay open on the table, its pages full of possibilities. Outside, the desert wind sang against the windows, but inside the cabin, hope burned brighter than the oil lamps, warming the room with its golden promise. The walking stick stood in the corner like a promise waiting to be kept. Jake had spent 3 evenings carving it from a length of seasoned oak, his knife working the wood until it was smooth as silk beneath his fingers. The handle curved perfectly, for a woman's grip, and he'd even carved small wildflowers along its length, the kind that bloomed in the desert after rain. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth wrote when he presented it to her, "but perhaps premature. Faith, Mrs. Harper, got to have faith." 6 weeks had passed since Morrison's visit, 6 weeks of daily struggle that would have broken a weaker spirit. Each morning, Jake helped Elizabeth through the prescribed exercises, his strong hands supporting her as she fought to awaken sleeping nerves. The pain was excruciating, like lightning shooting through her legs, but she never complained, only gripped his shoulders tighter and pushed through. "Feel that?" Jake asked one morning, manipulating her foot in the prescribed pattern. Elizabeth's eyes flew wide. Her toe, her left small toe, had moved. Not much, barely a twitch, but it had responded to her will for the first time in over a year. "I saw it," Jake exclaimed, his face bright with joy. "You did it, Elizabeth." She was crying again, but laughing too, a sound he'd never heard from her. On her slate she wrote, "Such a small thing. A toe." "The biggest mountains are climbed one step at a time," Jake replied. "And every step starts with a toe." Their daily routine had evolved into something approaching partnership. After exercises, Jake would carry her to the porch, where she'd work on correspondence. She'd begun writing letters for the illiterate ranch hands in exchange for small coins, giving her the first money she'd earned since the accident. While she wrote, Jake would tell her about the ranch, about his plans for expanding the herd, about the foal that had been born just that week. "You should name her," he said one afternoon, describing the pretty paint filly. "Hope," Elizabeth wrote without hesitation. "She should be called Hope." Jake smiled. "Hope it is." But not everyone shared their optimism. A trip to town for supplies proved that Cedar Ridge's memory was long and its prejudices deep. Jake McKenna called Hiram Watts from across the general store. "Heard you're playing nursemaid to your dollar woman. How's that working out for you?" Jake continued loading his supplies, jaw tight. "Must be nice." Hiram continued, encouraged by Jake's silence. "Having a woman who can't run away. Perfect. For a man who couldn't keep his first wife alive." The store went silent. Jake set down the sack of flour he'd been holding and turned slowly. "Hiram, I'm going to give you one chance to apologize. For speaking truth. Your Mary's dead, and now you're wasting time on another broken—" Jake's fist connected with Hiram's jaw before he could finish. The larger man went down hard, scattering canned goods across the floor. "Anyone else have opinions about Mrs. Harper?" Jake asked the stunned store. Silence greeted him. "Good. Mr. Patterson, I'll take these supplies now." But when he returned to the wagon, he found Elizabeth had heard everything. Her face was pale, her hands twisted in her lap. "I'm ruining your reputation," she wrote when they were away from town. "My reputation can go to hell. You defended your wife's memory. I'm sorry he used me to hurt you." Jake pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small stream. "Elizabeth, look at me." When she did, he continued, "Mary's gone. I'll carry her in my heart forever, but she's gone. You're here, you're alive, and you're the strongest person I know. Don't let small-minded fools make you think otherwise. Why are you so kind to me?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Jake studied his hands on the reins, searching for words. "My pa used to say that kindness costs nothing but pays dividends, but truth is, you make it easy to be kind. The way you face each day, the way you've brought life back to that empty cabin, I should be thanking you." That evening, as they practiced her exercises, Elizabeth's foot flexed deliberately. Then her ankle. Small movements but controlled, purposeful. "Jake," she said aloud, the first time she'd spoken his name. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but sweet as spring water. He nearly dropped her in surprise. "You spoke?" "I've been practicing," she admitted, her cheeks pink. "When you're out with the horses, I wanted to surprise you." "Consider me surprised," he said, grinning like a fool. That night, she insisted on trying the parallel. "Bars." Jake hovered anxiously as she gripped the smooth wood, using her arms to support most of her weight. Her legs trembled, muscles fighting to remember their purpose. She managed to stand for 3 seconds before her strength gave out, Jake catching her safely. 3 seconds today," she gasped, exhausted but triumphant. 4 seconds tomorrow, however long it takes, Jake promised. As she settled into her chair, Elizabeth touched the walking stick he'd carved. "Soon," she said aloud, savoring the word. Soon. Jake built up the fire and settled into his evening routine, but tonight was different. Tonight, the cabin filled with conversation. Halting at first, Elizabeth's voice growing stronger with the "yous." They talked of everything and nothing. The ranch, her teaching days, his childhood in Texas, her favorite books. "I haven't laughed this much since," Jake paused, realizing, "in a very long time." "Nor I," Elizabeth admitted. "Jake, thank you for everything, but especially for seeing me as more than my circumstances." "You've never been your circumstances," he said firmly. "You've always been you." As the fire burned low, they sat in companionable silence, each lost in thought. The walking stick waited in its corner, no longer a premature promise, but an approaching certainty. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, and the desert wind whispered secrets to the sage. But inside the cabin, two wounded souls continued their slow dance of healing, each step bringing them closer to something neither had dared name. Not yet, but soon. The storm announced itself with a wall of dust that turned day to twilight. Jake had seen it building on the horizon while checking the cattle, the sky taking on an ominous green-gray cast that promised violence. He'd raced back to the cabin, securing everything he could before the tempest hit. "It's going to be a bad one," he told Elizabeth, barring the shutters. "These summer storms can last for days." Elizabeth, now able to stand for minutes at a time with the parallel bars, made her way to the window before he closed it. "I've never seen clouds that color." The first crack of thunder shook the cabin to its foundation. Rain followed, not the gentle patter of eastern storms, but a deluge that hammered the roof like artillery fire. Within minutes, water began seeping through a weak spot in the roof, directly above Elizabeth's bed. "Damn!" Jake grabbed buckets, pots, anything that could catch water. "I should have fixed that last month." "You couldn't have known," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger now from weeks of use. She tried to help, taking a few trembling steps from the bars, but her legs gave out. Jake caught her before she fell. "Easy now, let me handle this." But the leak worsened, water streaming in faster than the containers could catch it. The bed was soaked, the floor becoming treacherous. Jake made a quick decision, lifting Elizabeth in his arms. "We'll move everything to the main room, make camp by the fireplace until this passes." For hours, they worked together, Jake hauling furniture and Elizabeth directing from her chair, organizing their temporary living space. Thunder crashed overhead like God's own fury, and lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white flashes. The wind howled through every tiny gap, carrying the sharp scent of rain and sage. By nightfall, they were exhausted but settled. Jake had created a makeshift bed for Elizabeth near the fire, piling every dry blanket and pillow to make her comfortable. His own bedroll lay nearby, closer than propriety would normally allow, but the storm made its own rules. "I've been through worse," Elizabeth said, watching him fuss over her comfort. "After the accident, I spent 3 days in a barn during a blizzard. The family that found me, they weren't sure I'd survive, so they didn't waste house space on me." Jake's hands stilled. "Elizabeth, it's all right, I lived." She managed a small smile. "Though I thought I'd never be warm again. Even after my body healed, the cold seemed to live in my bones." "You're warm now," Jake said, adding another log to the fire. "And you'll stay that way, I promise." The storm raged on, turning the cabin into an island in a sea of chaos. They ate cold biscuits and preserved peaches, listening to the wind try to tear the roof away. During a particularly violent gust, Elizabeth gasped and clutched something at her throat. "What is it?" Jake asked, concerned. Slowly, she pulled out a chain he'd never seen before. Hanging from it was a small gold locket. I've kept this hidden. It was my mother's." "Why hidden?" "Because it's all I have left of my old life. I was afraid someone would take it, sell it." Her fingers trembled as she opened the tiny clasp, revealing 2 miniature photographs, a distinguished man with kind eyes and a woman who shared Elizabeth's delicate features. "Your parents?" She nodded. "Papa was a schoolmaster. Mama played piano in church. They died when I was 19, just before I married Thomas." She touched the photographs gently. "I used to tell them everything when I was alone, about the pain, the fear, the humiliation. But lately, I've been telling them about you, about the kindness I'd forgotten existed, about learning to hope again." She looked up at him, green eyes luminous in the firelight. "They would have liked you, Jake McKenna." Jake's throat felt tight. "I'm honored you'd think so." A massive thunderclap shook the cabin, and Elizabeth instinctively reached for his hand. He held it, feeling the delicate bones, the calluses from gripping the parallel bars, the warm pulse of life. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "Not of the storm, of being a burden to you forever. What if I never walk properly? What if—" "Stop!" Jake squeezed her hand gently. "You could never be a burden. Never. You've brought more life to this. place in 3 months than I managed in 3 years. The cabin smells like bread again. There's laughter. There's conversation. There's purpose. But I can't be a proper wife to anyone. I can't run a household, can't—" Who said anything?
About being a wife?
Jake interrupted, though his heart raced at the word. "You're Elizabeth Harper, teacher, letter writer, survivor. You're complete as you are." Elizabeth studied his face in the flickering light. "Sometimes, the way you look at me, how do I look at you? Like I'm whole, like I'm not broken at all." "Because you're not," Jake said fiercely. "You're the strongest person I know. You face every day with courage I can't fathom. You're healing, yes, but you were never broken, just bent a little. Like a tree after a storm, still standing, still growing toward the sun." They sat in silence, hands still clasped, listening to the storm's fury. The roof leaked in 2 more places, but Jake had positioned buckets to catch the worst of it. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Tell me about Mary," Elizabeth said softly. "I'd like to know her." Jake's hand tightened reflexively, then relaxed. She was sunshine, always singing, always finding something to laugh about. She could make a feast from nothing, could gentle the wildest horse, could make me believe I was a better man than I was. "You're a good man, Jake. I try to be. For her memory. For—" he looked at Elizabeth, "for you." The storm reached its crescendo near dawn, wind and rain battling for dominance. A piece of the barn roof tore away with a shriek of metal, and Jake started to rise, but Elizabeth held him back. "Let it go. Things can be rebuilt." They dozed fitfully as the storm began to exhaust itself, still sitting close, Elizabeth's hand in Jake's. When she woke, she found he'd covered her with his own blanket, sitting guard through the night to ensure she stayed warm and dry. "The sun's coming out," he said, seeing her wake. Through the window, they could see the first rays breaking through dissipating clouds, turning the rain-washed world to gold. The desert would bloom after this storm, Jake knew. Flowers would carpet the usually barren ground, beauty born from violence. "We survived," Elizabeth said. "We did." She squeezed his hand, still held in hers. "Together, together," Jake agreed. And in that word lay a promise neither was quite ready to voice, but both were beginning to understand. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the desert air washed clean by the week's earlier storm. Jake was preparing breakfast when he heard a sound that made him drop the skillet. Footsteps. Slow, careful, but unmistakably footsteps. He turned to find Elizabeth standing by the parallel bars, but not gripping them. Instead, her hand rested lightly on the walking stick he'd carved, her knuckles white with effort, but her face radiant with determination. "Elizabeth," he started toward her, but she held up her free hand. "Wait, I need to do this." She took a step. Her leg trembled, the movement awkward and painful, but it held her weight. Another step, then another. By the 4th step, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling, a smile that could have lit the entire territory. "How long have you been practicing without me?" Jake asked, his voice rough with emotion. 2 weeks. Early mornings when you're with the horses. I wanted to surprise you. Consider me surprised." He moved closer, ready to catch her if needed. "How far can you go?" "To the door and back. Once, then I'm done for the day." She laughed shakily. "But it's a start. It's a miracle." "No," Elizabeth corrected, taking another careful step. "It's work, your faith, Doc Morrison's knowledge, and sheer stubbornness." She reached the door, touching it like a talisman before turning back. "I want to walk to church today." Jake's eyebrows rose. "That's near a 1/4 mile. I know I'll need help. The stick, your arm. I'll probably have to rest several times. But Jake, I need to show them the town. I need them to see that their dollar purchase, their damaged goods, can stand on her own feet." He understood. This wasn't about pride. It was about reclaiming her dignity in the most public way possible. "Then we'll get you to church," he promised. The morning preparations took longer than usual. Elizabeth insisted on wearing her best dress. the blue one she'd mended with tiny, perfect stitches. Jake helped her with her hair, his big fingers surprisingly gentle as he pinned it up the way she directed. When she stood before the small mirror, leaning on her stick, she looked every inch a lady. "You're beautiful," Jake said without thinking, then flushed red. Elizabeth's cheeks pinked, but she smiled. "Thank you. Shall we show Cedar Ridge what $1 can buy?" The walk to town was slow, measured in small victories. 20 steps, then rest, 30 steps, then rest. Jake's arm was steady beneath hers, taking much of her weight without making it obvious. Citizens began to notice as they entered the main street. Curtains twitched, doors opened. Whispers followed their progress like ripples in a pond. "They're all watching," Elizabeth murmured. "Let them watch," Jake replied. "Let them see courage." Hiram Watts stood outside the mercantile, his jaw still showing the bruise from Jake's fist. His eyes widened as Elizabeth approached, walking. His wife, Constance, clutched his arm, her expression shifting from shock to something like shame. "Morning, Hiram." "Mrs. Watts," Jake said pleasantly. "Fine day for church." They managed no response, struck dumb by the sight of Elizabeth moving. Under her own power, the church steps presented a challenge, but Elizabeth faced them with the same determination she'd shown for months. One at a time, leaning heavily on Jake and her stick, she climbed. At the top she paused, breathing hard but victorious. The congregation was already seated, but a hush fell as Jake and Elizabeth entered. Every head turned. Some faces showed shock, others disbelief. A few, precious few, showed something approaching. Admiration. They made their way slowly down the aisle. Their usual seats were in the back, where Jake had been sitting alone for 3 years. But today, Elizabeth led them forward, to the 4th pew, where the established families sat. Mrs. Morrison, the doctor's wife, stood quickly. "Please, Mrs. Harper, sit here." It was the first time anyone besides Jake had used her proper name in public. Elizabeth sank gratefully onto the bench, her legs trembling from the effort. Jake sat beside her, close enough to catch her if needed. Pastor Williams, a young man with kind eyes and an unfortunate stutter, climbed to the pulpit. He'd prepared a sermon on the Good Samaritan, but seeing Elizabeth, he set aside his notes. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his stutter disappearing as it always did when he spoke from the heart. "We are witnesses to a miracle today. Not the kind from Scripture, with angels and burning bushes, but the quiet kind. The kind born of determination, faith, and," he looked directly at Jake, "uncommon kindness." The sermon that followed was about second chances, about seeing beyond surface appearances, about the true meaning of Christian charity. More than one person shifted uncomfortably as William spoke of those who pass by on the other side, when faced with human need. When it came time for hymns, Elizabeth stood again. Her voice, sweet and clear, joined the congregation in amazing grace. Jake, who rarely sang, found himself adding his rough baritone to hers. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The words had never held more meaning. After the service, something unprecedented happened. People approached them, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth. Mrs. Morrison pressed Elizabeth's hand. The schoolmaster's wife inquired about her teaching experience. Even Constance Watts managed a grudging nod. "You've done something remarkable, Mrs. Harper," Pastor Williams said, taking her hand. "You've reminded us all what real strength looks like." The walk home was even slower, Elizabeth's energy nearly spent. Twice Jake had to nearly carry her, but she insisted on entering the cabin on her own feet. "I did it," she gasped, collapsing into her chair. "I walked to church. I stood with the congregation. You showed them all," Jake finished. "You showed them who Elizabeth Harper really is." "McKenna," she said softly. "What?" "At church, when Mrs. Morrison introduced me to her sister, she called me Mrs. McKenna. I didn't correct her." Jake's heart stopped, then resumed at double speed. "Elizabeth, I know we're not I know this isn't, but it felt right. Just for a moment it felt right. She looked up at him, vulnerable and hopeful. Was that wrong of me? Jake knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Nothing about you could ever be wrong. The church bell rang in the distance, calling the evening service. But here in the cabin, another kind of service was taking place. Two hearts beginning. To acknowledge what had been growing between them for months. Not yet love, perhaps, but something deep and true and full of promise. Elizabeth had stood tall in church that day, but it was here, in the quiet of home, that she truly rose. Jake McKenna stood in Johnson's Mercantile, staring at the bolt of cream-colored silk as if it might bite him. For a man who could face down outlaws and break wild horses, the prospect of purchasing wedding fabric reduced him to nervous fidgeting. "It's real pretty, Jake," Mrs. Johnson said, a knowing smile on her face. "Perfect for a wedding dress, I'd say." "I didn't say anything about a wedding," Jake muttered, but his red ears betrayed him. "You didn't have to. The whole town's been watching you two dance around each other for months. About time, if you ask me." Jake's transformation had been gradual but complete. The hollow-eyed widower who'd haunted Cedar Ridge for 3 years was gone, replaced by a man who whistled while he worked and smiled at nothing in particular. Everyone knew the cause: Elizabeth Harper, the woman he'd bought for $1 who'd turned out to be priceless. "I'll take the whole bolt," Jake said. "Finally. And whatever else you'd recommend for a proper wedding dress." Mrs. Johnson's smile widened. "Leave it to me. My niece is handy with a needle. We'll make something beautiful." But there was one problem. Jake had to actually propose first. For 3 days, he practiced speeches in the barn, much to the amusement of his horses. He'd start strong, Elizabeth these past month, then stumble over his words like a schoolboy. How did you tell a woman that she'd brought you back to life? That her courage had shown you what real strength looked like? That you'd started thinking of her first thing in the morning and last thing at night? Just tell her the truth, he finally told his reflection in the water trough. Tell her you love her, because he did. Lord help him, he loved her with a depth that scared him. Not the young, fierce love he'd had for Mary, that had been spring lightning, bright and sudden. This was different. This was deep water, steady and strong. The kind of love built on shared struggles and quiet evenings, and the miracle of watching someone heal. Elizabeth was in the garden when he found his courage. She'd taken to tending the vegetables, able now to walk for hours with just her stick for support. The late afternoon sun caught her hair, turning it to burnished gold, and Jake's carefully rehearsed words fled. "You're staring," Elizabeth said without turning around. "Is something wrong?" "No." "Yes, maybe." Jake took a breath. "Elizabeth, I need to say something." She turned then, and perhaps she saw something in his face, because her hands stilled on the tomato plants she'd been tying. "I've been thinking about that paper, the bill of sale from the auction." Elizabeth's face went carefully neutral. "Oh, I want to burn it. Should have months ago. You're not property, never were. But before I do," Jake pulled the document from his pocket, hands shaking slightly. "I wondered if you might want to replace it with a different paper, a marriage certificate." The garden went silent except for the whisper of wind through cornstalks. "I'm not doing this right," Jake continued, words tumbling out. "I had a speech planned about how you've changed everything, how the cabin feels like home again, how your strength makes me want to be a better man. But standing here, all I can think is that I love you. Not because I saved you or you needed me, but because you're Elizabeth, because you face each day with grace I can't fathom, because you've shown me that broken things can be made whole again, stronger for the breaking." He dropped to one knee in the dirt, producing a small velvet box. "This was my mother's ring. It's not fancy, but it's real. Like what I'm offering, a real marriage, a real life together. If you'll have me." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She gripped her walking stick tighter, then, with careful deliberation, set it aside. She took 2 unsteady steps forward and knelt, facing him, her hands covering his on the ring box. "Jake McKenna," she said, her voice thick with emotion, You gave me my life back. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You've been patient and kind and everything I never dared hope for. Yes, yes, I'll marry you, not because you saved me, but because somewhere between that auction block and this garden, I fell in love with you too." Jake's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was simple, a gold band with a small sapphire, but on Elizabeth's hand, it looked perfect. "There's more," Jake said, helping her stand. "I've arranged for a wedding dress, and I want to do this proper. In church, with the whole town watching. I want everyone to see that you're choosing this, choosing me. A real wedding," Elizabeth breathed. "Not a transaction, never a transaction. A celebration." They stood in the garden holding each other. As the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elizabeth's stick lay forgotten in the dirt. She didn't need it, not with Jake's arms around her. "There's one more thing," Jake said into her hair. "I've been corresponding with a judge in Tucson about making the adoption official." Elizabeth pulled back, confused. "Adoption? Of you? By me? Legally, you're still—" He grimaced. "The law's a mess about these things. But if I adopt you first, then marry you, it breaks any claim that bill of sale might have. You'll be a free woman marrying of your own choice. You'd go through all that? The legal fees, the travel? I'd go to hell and back to make sure you're free." Elizabeth kissed him then, their first real kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both were breathless. "When?" she asked. "I was thinking next month. Give your dress. Time to be finished, let you get stronger for the dancing." "Dancing? Jake, I can barely walk without my stick. Then we'll dance slow, or not at all. I just want you as my wife." That evening, as they sat by the fire planning their future, Jake brought out something else, architectural drawings for additions to the cabin. "What's this?" Elizabeth asked, studying the papers. "Plans for a schoolroom addition. Thought you might want to teach again. The town needs a school, and I need to see you doing what you love." Elizabeth's eyes filled again. "You'd build me a school? I'd build you a cathedral if you asked. But I figure we'll start with a schoolroom and see where life takes us." As the fire burned low, they talked of the future, of children who might fill the cabin with laughter, of students who would learn their letters at Elizabeth's knee, of years stretching ahead filled with ordinary miracles. The bill of sale lay on the table between them. Together they fed it to the flames, watching the ugly past turn to ash. In its place was something infinitely more precious. A ring, a promise, and a love that had grown from the rockiest of soil. Jake had paid $1 for a broken woman. He'd received a treasure beyond price. And Elizabeth, sold as property, had found her way to a love that set her free. The wedding dress hung in Mrs. Johnson's shop, waiting. The whole town buzzed with anticipation. But here in the quiet cabin, two hearts had already joined, united by something stronger than any paper could proclaim. They were home. The stranger arrived on the Tuesday coach, his presence as unwelcome as a rattlesnake at a prayer meeting. Bartholomew Crowder was a small man, made smaller by his hunched posture and darting eyes, but the legal papers he carried gave him a giant's reach. Jake first heard about him from Sam Patterson at the Mercantile. "Says he's looking for you, Jake. Got a lawyer look about him." Jake found Crowder at the hotel, sipping whiskey in the lobby like he owned the place. "Mr. McKenna, I represent the interests of the Western Territories Mail-Order Bride Company. I understand you're in possession of our property. I'm in possession of nothing but what's mine," Jake said evenly. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong." Crowder produced a sheaf of papers. "One Elizabeth Harper, purchased through our agency, remains the legal property of the company until her contract is fulfilled. The $1 you paid was merely a transfer fee. She owes us 3 years of service or $500 in compensation." Jake's hand moved to his gun, but Crowder smiled thinly. "Violence won't solve this, Mr. McKenna. The law is quite clear. Unless you can produce the compensation, Miss Harper must be returned to fulfill her obligation elsewhere. Mrs. Harper is a free woman, and soon to be my wife. Marriage without our consent violates the contract. It would be invalid." Crowder's smile widened. "However, I'm a reasonable man. Pay the $500, and I'll tear up the contract right now." $500. It might as well have been 5,000. Jake had money saved, but not near that much, not after the medical expenses and the planned wedding. "You have until Friday," Crowder said. "Then I'll be forced to involve the territorial marshal." Jake returned home to find Elizabeth teaching. Letters to the Morrison children, her face bright with the joy of having students again. The sight of her happiness made his heart clench. "Jake, what's wrong?" He told her everything. Watched the color drain from her face, saw her hands tremble as she gripped her walking stick. "I won't go back," she whispered. "I won't be sold again." "You won't. I'll figure something out. Jake, no, you've done enough. I won't have you beggar yourself for my future wife. I'd sell everything I own." But word of Crowder's claim spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By evening, the town was divided. Some sided with the letter of the law, others with the spirit of human decency. Pastor Williams called an emergency town meeting. The church was packed that Thursday night. Crowder sat in the front row, legal papers spread before him like weapons. Jake and Elizabeth sat opposite, her hand in his, both refusing to show fear. Mayor Thompson, a portly man who preferred avoiding conflict, cleared his throat nervously. "We're here to discuss the situation regarding Mrs. Harper's legal status." "Miss Harper," Crowder corrected. "Any marriage would be invalid without company consent." "That's where you're wrong," a voice called from the back. Doc Morrison stood, holding a paper of his own. "I've been researching the territorial laws. Mail-order contracts can be voided for medical reasons. I'm prepared to testify that Miss Harper's paralysis made her unable to fulfill standard marriage duties at the time of transfer." "She seems quite recovered now," Crowder countered. "Thanks to months of treatment and care," Morrison shot back. "Care provided by Mr. McKenna at considerable expense. If anyone's owed compensation, it's him." The room erupted in arguments. Hiram Watt stood, still nursing his grudge. "The law's the law. If McKenna can't pay, the woman goes back. She's not property." Mrs. Morrison stood beside her husband. "She's a human being, a teacher, a member of our community, a crippled woman who can barely walk." Watt sneered. Elizabeth stood then, setting aside her stick. She walked to the front of the room, each step deliberate, controlled. No one spoke. As she made her way to face the assembly, "My name," she said, her teacher's voice carrying to every corner, "is Elizabeth Harper. I'm not property. I'm not a commodity to be bought, sold, or transferred. Yes, I was paralyzed. Yes, I was sold at auction like livestock. But I am a person. I have taught your children their letters. I have written your correspondence. I have become part of this community." She turned to Crowder. "You speak of contracts and compensation. What compensation did I receive for being torn from my home, for being shipped west like freight, for being displayed on an auction block while men decided my worth?" "The contract," Crowder began. "The contract is an abomination," Elizabeth continued. "And everyone in this room knows it. You've all watched Jake McKenna restore my dignity, my health, my hope. You've seen him treat me not as property, but as a person worthy of respect and love. And now you'll sit here and debate whether I should be dragged back to slavery." Jake stood beside her, proud and fierce. "I'll pay the $500. I'll sell my ranch if I have to." "No." Elizabeth gripped his hand. "We face this together, or not at all." An unexpected voice spoke up. "I'll put in $50. Mrs. Johnson stood, clutching her purse. "This woman will wear the wedding dress my niece made if I have anything to say about it." $25. From me," Sam Patterson added. "Jake's been a good customer and a better neighbor." One by one, people stood. Not everyone. Watts and his supporters remained seated, but enough. The Morrisons, the pastor and his wife. Ranch hands Jake had helped through tough times, even some who'd mocked Elizabeth initially, shamed by her dignity. Crowder watched his case crumble as the pledges mounted. "This is highly irregular," So is selling human beings, Pastor Williams said firmly. Mr. Crowder, I believe you'll find the community has spoken. By the meeting's end, they'd raised $300. Jake would contribute his savings for the rest. Crowder, faced with a united town and the likelihood of territorial judges siding with local sentiment, accepted the payment with ill grace. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. As Crowder prepared the release documents, she spoke once more. I want it in writing, not just my freedom, but acknowledgement that the original contract was invalid, that no woman should be sold as property regardless of her circumstances. Crowder hesitated, but the crowd's mood was clear. He wrote the addendum, each word pulled from him like a tooth. When it was done, when the papers were signed and witnessed, Jake did something that shocked everyone. He walked to the church's old bell rope and pulled. The bronze bell rang out over Cedar Ridge, clear and strong. Let everyone hear, he called out. Elizabeth Harper is a free woman, and on Saturday, she'll become my wife by her own free choice. The cheer that went up could have been heard in Tucson. Later, as they walked home under the stars, Elizabeth leaning on Jake's arm more from emotion than necessity, she stopped suddenly. Jake, the money the town raised. We can't accept that. Much charity. It's not charity, Jake said firmly. It's investment in the school you'll build, the children you'll teach, the community you've already made better. They're not giving to us, Elizabeth. They're giving to their own future. She stood on her toes and kissed him, there in the middle of the dusty street. Our future, Jake agreed, and in those two words lay a promise that no contract could bind and no law could break. The legal document that had declared Elizabeth property lay in Jake's pocket, ready for burning. But the paper that mattered, the one that would declare them husband and wife, waited for Saturday, when the whole town would witness love's victory over law. Saturday dawned with the kind of crystalline perfection that made the desert seem like paradise. Jake stood before his shaving mirror, hands trembling slightly as he scraped away stubble. In the main room, Sam Patterson and Doc Morrison waited to stand as his groomsmen, both grinning at his nervousness. Never seen you this jumpy, Sam teased. Not even that time you faced down those cattle rustlers. Rustlers are simple, Jake muttered. You know where you stand with rustlers. Doc. Morrison chuckled. You know where you stand with Elizabeth too, Jake. Right beside her, where you belong. Across town, in the best room at the boarding house, Elizabeth sat before a proper vanity mirror while Mrs. Johnson and her niece made final adjustments to the wedding dress. The cream silk fell in elegant lines, disguising the slight hitch in her walk, emphasizing instead her natural grace. You're beautiful, Mrs. Morrison said, pinning orange blossoms in Elizabeth's hair, like a picture from Godey's Lady's Book. Elizabeth touched the fabric wonderingly. I never thought I'd wear a dress like this. When I was sold, I thought beauty was behind me forever. Nothing could diminish your beauty, Mrs. Johnson said firmly. It comes from inside, and Lord knows you've got more inner beauty than anyone I've met. The walking stick Jake had carved waited by the door, polished too. A high shine and wrapped with white ribbon. Elizabeth would walk to her wedding under her own power. A final declaration of independence before choosing to bind her life to another. The church filled early. It seemed all of Cedar Ridge had come to witness what many called the wedding of the decade. The very pews that had whispered cruel gossip now buzzed with excitement and genuine good wishes. Even Hiram Watts had come, his wife having apparently given him no choice in the matter. Pastor Williams stood at the altar, his ceremonial robes freshly pressed. Beside him waited Jake, resplendent in his one good suit, his weathered face showing a nervousness that made him look younger, almost boyish. Then the church doors opened and Elizabeth appeared. A collective intake of breath greeted her entrance. She stood framed in sunlight, the cream dress catching the light like captured moonbeams. But it wasn't the dress that stopped hearts. It was the radiant joy on her face, the confident way she gripped her decorated walking stick, the clear green eyes that found Jake's and never looked away, The wedding march began, played on the old pump organ by the pastor's wife. Elizabeth started down the aisle, each step measured but sure. No one to give her away. She came of her own free will, under her own power, choosing her own destiny. Halfway down the aisle, her stick caught on a raised board. For a heart-stopping moment, she wavered. Without hesitation, Jake left his place at the altar and strode to meet her, offering his arm. "Together," he murmured. "Always," she replied. They walked the rest of the way as they would walk through life, side by side, supporting each other, neither leading nor following, but moving. As one, the ceremony itself was simple but profound. Pastor Williams, who had found his confidence in recent weeks, spoke eloquently of love that transcends circumstances, of strength found in vulnerability, of two broken hearts making one whole soul. "Do you, Jacob Thomas McKenna, take Elizabeth Grace Harper to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake said, his voice strong and certain. "With all my heart, I do." "Do you, Elizabeth Grace Harper, take Jacob Thomas McKenna to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" Elizabeth's voice carried clear and true. "I do. By my own free choice, I do." The rings were special. Jake's mother's wedding band for Elizabeth, and for Jake, a simple gold band that incorporated the silver dollar from the auction, melted down and reformed into something beautiful. Past transformed into future, shame into joy. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender, almost reverent, a seal on promises that went deeper than words. When they parted, both had tears in their eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Williams announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jacob McKenna." The cheer that erupted could have raised the roof. Elizabeth and Jake turned to face their community, her hand on his arm, both glowing with happiness. As they walked back down the aisle, rice rained down like blessings, thrown by hands that had once pointed in mockery, but now celebrated love's triumph. The reception was held in the town hall, transformed with wildflowers and ribbons. Tables groaned under the weight of donated food. Everyone had contributed something, making it truly a community celebration. Jake had worried about Elizabeth tiring, but she seemed to draw strength from the joy around her. "Dance with me," she said as the fiddler struck up a waltz. "Elizabeth, your legs will hold me for one dance with my husband. Please, Jake. I've dreamed of this." They moved slowly, carefully, Jake supporting most of her weight without making it obvious. Elizabeth's head rested on his shoulder, and they swayed more than danced. But to everyone watching, they were Fred and Ginger, grace personified. "I love you, Mrs. McKenna," Jake whispered. "And I love you, Mr. McKenna. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for saving me right back." As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth did tire, finding a chair from which to reign over the festivities like a queen. Children she'd taught brought her flowers. Women who'd once snubbed her pressed her hands and wished her well. Even Hiram Watts managed a grudging congratulations, but the moment that brought fresh tears was when Doc Morrison stood to make a toast. "When Jake first brought me to examine Elizabeth, I thought I was looking at a medical case. What I found instead was a testament to the human spirit. Elizabeth, you've taught us all that the body's limitations are nothing compared to the heart's determination. And Jake, you've shown us that real love isn't about possession, it's about recognition. Recognizing the worth in another person and fighting to help them see it too." He raised his glass. "To the McKennas, may their love story inspire us all to look beyond surfaces, to see with the heart rather than the eyes, and to never ever give up on hope." As the sun set, Jake carried Elizabeth over the threshold of their cabin, now truly their home. He'd wanted to hire a wagon, but she'd insisted on riding, sitting sideways on his gentle mare, her wedding dress spread around her like flower petals. "Welcome home, Mrs. McKenna," Jake said, setting her gently in the chair by the fire. "I've been home since the day you brought me here," Elizabeth replied. "Today just made it official." They sat together as darkness fell, still in their wedding clothes, hands entwined. On the mantel sat their marriage certificate, properly signed and witnessed. The bill of sale that had started their journey was long burned, its ashes scattered to the wind. In its place was something infinitely more precious, a love tested by fire, strengthened by struggle, and proved before the whole world. Jake had paid $1 for a broken woman. He'd received a wife, a partner, a soulmate. Elizabeth had been sold as damaged goods. She'd become the treasure of a good man's heart. And Cedar Ridge, a town that had witnessed cruelty on an auction block, had seen that same block become the foundation of a love story for the ages. The stars came out, blessing the desert with their ancient light. And in a small cabin where loneliness had once echoed, laughter rang out, the sound of two hearts, finally, truly, home. 3 months into their marriage, the letter arrived on the Tuesday coach. Jake found it waiting at the post office, the return address bearing the seal of a law firm in San Francisco, Thornbury, Ashford and Associates. He almost didn't give it to Elizabeth, sensing somehow that this crisp official envelope carried change within its folds. But secrets had no place in their marriage, so he handed it to her that evening as she sat grading papers from her growing group of students. Elizabeth's face went white as she read. The paper fluttered from her nerveless fingers, and Jake caught it before it hit the floor. "My dear Mrs. Harper," it began, "we regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle Cornelius Harper, late of San Francisco. As his sole surviving relative, you are the beneficiary of his considerable estate." Jake's eyes skimmed the legal language until he reached the figure. $20,000, plus properties in California worth twice that. A fortune by any measure. "Elizabeth," he knelt beside her chair, "did you know about this uncle?" "Father's brother," she whispered. "They quarreled years ago. I thought he'd forgotten I existed. When I wrote after Thomas died asking for help, he never replied. I assumed he left you everything. Now he leaves me everything." Her laugh was bitter. "Where was this when I was being sold? Where was this when I couldn't walk, when I was worth $1 on an auction block?" Jake set the letter aside and took her hands. They were trembling. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking..." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I'm thinking you married a pauper who's suddenly rich. I'm thinking everything between us has changed. I'm thinking you'll believe I deceived you somehow." "Elizabeth, no, I didn't know." The words burst out of her. "I swear to you, Jake, I had no idea. If I had, would I have let myself be sold? Would I have accepted your charity all these months? Would I have..." Jake silenced her with a kiss. When he pulled back, his blue eyes were steady on hers. "I know you didn't deceive me. How could you? We've shared everything, every fear, every hope. This doesn't change anything between us." "It changes everything, don't you see? You married a broken woman who needed you. Now I'm wealthy, independent. I don't need..." "Is that what you think our marriage is based on? Need?" Jake's voice was quiet but intense. "Elizabeth, I didn't marry you because you needed me. I married you because I love you, because you make me laugh, because you're brilliant and brave and stubborn as a mule, because watching you teach those children fills me with pride, because every morning I wake up grateful you're beside me." Elizabeth was crying openly now. "But people will say..." "Let them say. Since when have we cared what people say? They said you'd never walk, but you danced at our wedding. They said our marriage was invalid, but we proved them wrong. They can say whatever they like about this money. What if you think I don't need you anymore?" Jake cupped her face gently. Do you not need me?" "I'll always need you," Elizabeth said fiercely. "Not for your strong back or your ranch or your protection. I need your laugh, your terrible singing when you think I'm not listening, the way you read to me by firelight, the way you see me, not the broken woman, not the wealthy woman, just me. Then nothing's changed. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Elizabeth spoke again. $20,000, Jake. We could go anywhere, do anything. You could have the biggest ranch in the territory. Is that what you want? Elizabeth looked around their modest cabin, the carefully mended curtains, the handmade furniture, the desk where she taught eager young minds. No, I want this life. Our life. But, the school. We could build a real school, with proper desks and books and slates for every child. We could bring in another teacher for the older students. We could... She stopped, seeing his grin. What? There's my Elizabeth. Handed a fortune and immediately thinking how to spend it on others. It's not just others, it's our community, our home. She paused. You really don't resent this? The money? Jake considered his words carefully. I'd be lying if I said it doesn't. Sting my pride a little. A man likes to provide for his wife, but Elizabeth, you've taught me there are different kinds of providing. You provide joy and purpose and intelligence. You've made this cabin a home, and this town a better place. If money is what you bring to add to what we're building together, then I'm grateful for it. We'll make decisions together, Elizabeth said firmly. Every penny spent is our choice, not mine alone. Agreed, though I suspect most of it will go to that school of yours. Our school, she corrected, and maybe a little for the ranch? I know you've had your eye on that pasture land to the south. Jake smiled. See, we're already thinking like partners. That night, they wrote a reply to the lawyers accepting the inheritance. But first, Jake did something that moved Elizabeth to fresh tears. He took out their family Bible, the one where they'd recorded their marriage, and wrote beside their names, "Equal partners in all things for all time." The money doesn't make you equal, he said. You always were. This just makes it official. In the world's eyes. Over the following days, word of Elizabeth's inheritance spread through Cedar Ridge. Some reactions were predictable. Hiram Watts grumbled about folks getting above themselves, but most were supportive. The town had watched Elizabeth's journey from auction block to altar, had seen her courage and determination. If anyone deserved a windfall, they agreed, it was her. But the true test came when Elizabeth stood before the town council with architectural plans for a proper schoolhouse. "We'll fund it entirely," she said, Jake beside her. "In exchange, we ask only that the town commit to hiring qualified teachers and never turning away a child who wants to learn." The vote was unanimous. As they walked home that evening, Elizabeth's gait steady with only occasional support from her walking stick, she said, "You know what the real revelation is?" "What's that?" "Not the money. Not the inheritance. It's that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. If Uncle Cornelius had helped when I asked, I'd never have come west, never been sold, never met you." Jake squeezed her hand. "Funny how the worst. Things can lead to the best things. Mr. McKenna," Elizabeth said with mock severity, "are you suggesting being sold for $1 was a good thing?" "I'm suggesting," Jake said, pulling her close, "that I'd pay any price for the life we have now. Dollar, fortune, or anything in between." Under the vast desert sky, with plans for a school in their pocket and love in their hearts, Jake and Elizabeth McKenna headed home. The inheritance that might have divided them had only proved what they already knew. Their wealth lay not in gold, but in the life they'd built from ashes, the love they'd forged from loneliness, and the future they'd create together. The letter from San Francisco had revealed a fortune, but Jake and Elizabeth had already discovered the only treasure that truly mattered. 1 year later, Elizabeth McKenna stood in the doorway of the new Cedar Ridge School, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The building was everything she'd dreamed: bright windows, proper desks, shelves lined with books donated from as far away as Boston. But it was the sound filling the rooms that made her heart swell, the voices of children learning. "Mrs. McKenna," young Sally Morrison ran up, braids flying. "Look, I wrote my whole name." Elizabeth examined the careful letters. "Beautiful work, Sally. Keep practicing, and soon you'll be writing letters to your grandmother back east." Jake appeared at her shoulder, his presence as comforting as ever. "Stagecoach just pulled in. You might want to see this." Through the window, Elizabeth watched the weekly coach discharge its passengers. Among them, a young woman struggled with a worn carpet bag, her movements awkward and fearful. But it was the auctioneer, the same Bartlett who'd sold Elizabeth, helping her down that made Elizabeth's breath catch. "Not again," she whispered. "Afraid so. Word is she's got a twisted foot, can barely walk. Family sent her west as a mail-order bride, but the man who paid for her passage took one look and refused her." Elizabeth's hand went to her walking stick. She still used it on long days, though more for balance than support now. "We're going to the auction. Elizabeth, you're 7 months pregnant. And I can still walk, thanks to you. We're going." The auction block looked smaller than Elizabeth remembered, though perhaps that was because she no longer viewed it from a place of despair. The crowd was smaller too. Many of the townspeople had lost their stomach for such spectacles after witnessing Elizabeth's story. The girl, she couldn't be more than 19, sat hunched in the same rough chair Elizabeth had occupied 2 years ago. Her clubfoot was visible beneath her patched dress, and her eyes held the same desperate dignity Elizabeth remembered feeling. "Damaged goods here, folks," Bartlett called, though with less enthusiasm than before. "Strong back, though. Good. For simple work. Starting bid, $5. Elizabeth called out, her teacher's voice carrying clear across the square. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Bartlett squinted. "Mrs. McKenna, I don't think—" $5, Elizabeth repeated, walking forward with Jake at her side. "And Mr. Bartlett, this is the last such auction you'll hold in Cedar Ridge. The town council voted last week. No more selling of human beings in our town, regardless of circumstances. You can't—" "We can." Jake's voice was quiet but firm. "Already spoke to the territorial marshal. These auctions violate the spirit of the law, if not the letter. Find another way to make your living." Bartlett, faced with the loss of his lucrative trade and the hostile stares of the crowd, had no choice. $5 then. She's yours." Elizabeth approached the girl slowly, remembering her own fear. "What's your name?" "Catherine," the girl whispered. "Catherine Wells." "Well, Catherine, I'm Elizabeth McKenna. This is my husband, Jake. You'll be coming home with us, but not as property, as our guest, until you decide what you want to do next." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I don't understand. "Why would you—" "Because 2 years ago, I sat in that same chair. Someone showed me kindness when the world showed me none. Now it's my turn to pass that kindness on." Jake lifted Catherine as gently as he'd once lifted Elizabeth, settling her in their wagon with the same care. As they drove to the ranch, Elizabeth told her story, the auction, the months of recovery, the love that bloomed from ashes. "You're the teacher," Catherine breathed. "Everyone in 3 counties knows about you. How you walked again, how you built the school." "With help," Elizabeth said, touching Jake's arm. "Always with help." At the ranch, they settled Catherine into the same room Elizabeth had once occupied. The girl stared in wonder at the clean, bright space, the books on the shelf, the view of mountains through the window. "Tomorrow, Doc Morrison will examine your foot," Elizabeth said. "He's got new ideas from medical journals back east. There might be treatments to help. And if there aren't, then we'll find other ways for you to build a life. Can you read and write?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me before she died." "Good. The school needs an assistant teacher. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work. And there's a young man, Tom Bradley, the blacksmith's apprentice, who's been asking about you since the stagecoach arrived. Seems you smiled at him at the last water stop." Catherine blushed. "He was kind. Helped me with my bag. Kindness is a good foundation," Jake said. "Better than most." That evening, as Catherine slept in her new room, Elizabeth and Jake sat on their porch watching the sunset. Elizabeth's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move. "Think it'll be a boy or girl?" Jake asked. "Doesn't matter, they'll be loved either way." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "We did the right thing today." "Never doubted it. Though folks will talk, taking in another broken bird." Let them talk. We know the truth. There are no broken birds, only birds who haven't yet remembered they can fly. Jake pulled out the family Bible, opening it to the page where their names were inscribed. Below them, in careful script, he added, Catherine Wells, taken in with love, June 15th. Starting a tradition, Elizabeth asked. Maybe. World's full of people who think they're worth nothing. Might be nice to show them otherwise. 6 weeks later, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy daughter they named Grace. Catherine, her foot responding well to treatment, stood as godmother. Tom Bradley stood as godfather, his admiration for Catherine clear to everyone. The school grew. The ranch prospered, and every few months it seemed someone new would arrive in Cedar Ridge, damaged, desperate, deemed worthless by the world. The McKennas never turned anyone away. Years later, when Elizabeth's hair was silver and Jake's face was lined with laugh lines, they would sit on that same porch, watching their grandchildren play. The family Bible was thick with names by then. People they'd helped, children they'd raised, lives they'd touched. Remember when you bought me for $1? Elizabeth would say, her walking stick now more decorative than necessary. Best dollar I ever spent, Jake would reply, as he always did. And it was true. From that single silver coin had grown a fortune. Beyond measuring, love, family, purpose, and a legacy of kindness that transformed an entire town. The auction block still stood in the town square, but now it held a plaque. On this spot, cruelty ended and compassion began. Let all who pass remember, every person has worth. Elizabeth McKenna, once sold for $1, had become priceless. And in teaching others their own worth, she'd found the greatest treasure of all, a life well lived, a love well given, and a future bright with hope. The circle was complete, and like all the best circles, it had no end.